eventually identified that these were the Helicobacter pylori bacteria, and he cultured them. He grew them in pure culture. And because no one would believe that the bacteria were causing the infection, what he did one day was he drank a load of the bacteria himself, and that immediately caused severe gastritis, and he went on to develop peptic ulceration, proving by reintroducing the bacterial culture into a healthy subject that the infection was caused by the Helicobacter pylori. But don't try it at home yourself. There's another fascinating story about one of these self-experimenters, a guy called John Hunter, who lived from 1728 to 1793, working mostly in London. He was a great English scientist and anatomist, and in fact he taught Edward Jenner, who we might learn about later. And John Hunter was the first to realise by systemic observation that inflammation is not a disease, but a feature of insulted tissue. But anyway, he thought the sexually transmitted diseases, the clap and the pox, were caused by a transmissible venereal poison. These days we'd call the clap gonorrhea and would call the pox syphilis, of course. And he actually thought that gonorrhea and syphilis were the same disease. So what he actually did was, in 1767, he acquired some infected pus from a patient with gonorrhea, with the clap. And I'm not quite sure whether he got this from a male or female patient, but he got the infected pus, and he inoculated himself with it. And of course he quickly developed signs and symptoms of gonorrhea. But then unfortunately later on he developed signs and symptoms of syphilis as well. And in his mind at the time, that made him think they were the same disease. You can kind of understand it, why he would think that. But he took the infectious agents, the pus from someone else, he put it onto himself, and he got the disease. Unfortunately, he wrongly thought that the two diseases were the same thing. And of course, the reason that happened was that the patient he took it from had been exposed to gonorrhea and to syphilis. And he did treat himself to some extent with local cautery and mercury. But he actually died in his 60s, probably of a complication of that syphilis, actually. So he took infected pus from someone with the disease, and he didn't culture it, but he reproduced the disease by introducing the causative agent, by infecting himself with a causative agent. Now certainly do not try that one at home, or lots of people will be very cross with me. We're thinking now about innate immunity. Now what do we mean by this term innate immunity? Well, innate immunity is also described as a non-specific immunity, because it will protect us against a wide variety of potential infectious organisms. So we've said immunity is the ability of the body to resist infection, and innate immunity it's the kind of immunity that we have by virtue of our anatomy and physiology working against a range of potential infective organisms. The body doesn't have to learn how to be immune to a particular organism in innate immunity. It will just naturally work against that organism. We will naturally be protected against that organism. And the other type of immunity, in contrast to innate immunity, is called acquired immunity. And acquired immunity is also described as specific immunity, because it is specific to a particular or a specific infectious organism. And with acquired immunity, the body must first be exposed to the organism, and it must learn how to be immune to that organism. It must acquire the immunity. So at one time with acquired immunity, at one time in the past we were not immune. Then as a result of being exposed to a particular organism, we become immune. We acquire the immunity. And this is specific to individual organisms. But on this podcast we want to talk about innate immunity, the mechanisms of innate immunity that we possess to a wide variety of infectious organisms, as a result of our anatomy and physiology. And if you've got one of the white physiology notebooks, you can turn to page 355 and look at this diagram. So let's think about the mechanisms of innate immunity now. And what we'll do is we'll start at the top of the body and work down, thinking about a few of them. Well, one of the first things to think about is in the eyes, of course, we have tears. And tears are produced at one corner of the eye and wash over the surface of the eye towards the middle where they drain in the nose side. So what you can see is the tears are produced on the outside, the lateral side of the eye at the top, and they wash over to the medial side of the eye. So already you can see there you've got a flushing effect, a washing effect. It's like if you had something dirty on your hand, you'd put it under a tap and wash it off. So any bacteria alighting onto the surface of the eye will be washed away in the tears. There's a flow through the body, there's a flow across the surface of the eye, a flowing effect. And as well as that, tears contain an enzyme called lysozyme. And lysozyme is very active in digesting bacterial cell walls, but thankfully doesn't damage human cells too much. So there's a flowing effect, a flushing effect in tears, and lysozyme is a digestive enzyme present in tears which will break down bacteria. If for some reason these mechanisms don't work, there's a nasty infection called conjunctivitis, where the eyes become red and it feels like you've got grit in the eye, very unpleasant, painful condition, which we might need to treat. Going down in the nose we have hairs. Now nose hair is very important because it filters out insects. Sometimes you might look after patients with openings directly into the trachea, a tracheostomy. And these patients can inhale insects through the opening if they're outside. So that's why we sometimes have to put a little grid over the surface of the tracheostomy opening. And we actually call it a nose, a meshwork to keep insects out. So sometimes we need to put a nose on our tracheostomies. But the nose contains hair that does this naturally. And the nose, in combination with the mouth, the airways, all of the gastrointestinal tract, are lined by mucous membranes. And mucous membranes, if they're intact, will keep bacteria out fairly effectively. Because as well as an intact membrane, on top of that there is a layer of mucus. And the layer of mucus helps to keep the bacteria out. And mucous membranes are important in different parts of the body. So we've got the nose, the mouth, the esophagus, the gastrointestinal tract, the respiratory tract, and the genital tract, all lined by mucous membranes. And if these mucous membranes are intact, then infection is less likely to get into the underlying membrane. Now we could illustrate what goes wrong sometimes in this by thinking about HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, which of course can lead to the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, AIDS. Because studies have shown that if people have pre-existing sexually transmitted diseases which have disrupted the genital mucous membrane, then it's much, much easier for the virus to get in. So if someone has exposure to the HIV virus with an intact mucous membrane, of course there is some risk that they will acquire the HIV infection. But if someone has already got a pre-existing sexually transmitted disease and the genital mucosa is already disrupted, then it becomes much more likely that a certain degree of viral exposure will result in systemic infection. So mucous membranes are very important. The mouth contains saliva, and saliva, again we've got the flushing effect, the washing effect, same as we had in the eyes. And the mouth also contains what we call commensal bacteria. These are bacteria that live with us, and we give them a nice place to live, and they're also good for us. And what the commensal bacteria do is they occupy the ecological niche of the mouth, because obviously the mouth's exposed to the outside world. It's not going to be a sterile environment. And in fact, human mouths have got a colossal amount of bacteria in there, but they're our own bacteria that we live with quite happily. It's a